Well, normally people just want me to give them lead, to be candid. Normally the conversation starts off where they say, wow, either I really don't use products, so let's just talk about pharmaceutical stuff, or do you have any gummies? Or what do you think of this product? It's usually a good conversation starter, and just the kind of things that you see on a monthly basis in the cannabis business, you just lose your mind.
Hey, Erum, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Karl. What are you thinking about this crazy weather?
It's late February. We've had one sprinkling of snow in New York City, and it feels like it's 50 degrees every day, even though that's not totally true. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm missing the snow. I feel like now that I'm saying that, watch it, there be a blizzard tomorrow, but things are changing. It was clear now. It's clear that we had 60-degree weather in January in New York City. Yeah, it's cool because I do like that temperature. I like 60 to 75 degrees. That's my favorite. I don't like it when it's super hot, but it's a sign of the times, unfortunately. And what does that mean for biology, like in the environment? What's that mean for invasive species? What does that mean for plants? If I see that lanternfly come back, I'm gonna be really upset.
They're not going away. But I think you bring up a really good point, because I was saying to my wife, Kristen, that in 10 years, we might really remember when we stopped having winter in New York City, because we were so used to having these massive snowstorms, like maybe not every year, but regularly. Like I said, there's only been a sprinkling of snow all year. So it's been a very mild winter. And I think, like you say, it is a sign of the times.
Yeah. And there's heavy snow happening in Houston and other places. And you're like, okay, all right, what's really happening here? Climate change is in full effect.
Yeah. Speaking of climate change, there was some exciting news in the biotech industry a couple of weeks ago. A climate tech biotech company, Tech, lots of tech there. They recycle carbon using biotechnology. They IPO'd. That was a $2.2 billion transaction. So it was a very large, healthy IPO for a climate tech biotech company. So we're very excited about them. We know a lot of the people that work at Tech, and I hope that at some point we can get some of them on the podcast.
Yeah. And what do they do exactly? So like they have a reactor that goes into a steel mill, and like the emissions go into their reactor where there's bacteria that transforms it into like biofuels or something like that.
It could be biofuels. It could be a biomaterial. I think they have a deal with H&M where they're producing threads. Wow. So there's a lot of applications, and there's a few other companies that are similar to Tech where they can convert a waste gas into a product. I think it's a very difficult process. So I think we should really get someone from Tech on the podcast to really tell us what they do. But I thought it was an exciting IPO.
Yeah, absolutely. We definitely will have them on. In my past life, I did work with a company that recycled carbon emissions into carbon nanotubes.
That's right.
Very, very ahead of its time. But I'm glad to see that this technology is now being adopted widely and big enough that these companies are IPOing, and it's just very exciting to see.
So I'm excited about our conversation today. We're not going to be talking about climate. We're having a conversation that's going to be about cannabis and biotech.
Whoa, cannabis!
Which could be controversial for some of our listeners, but there is an overlap between cannabis and biotech. And the person who we're going to be interviewing is my friend Seth Yakatan, someone who I've known for many years. And Seth is in a unique position, having funded and started several biotech companies, and then also working very extensively in the cannabis space in California.
I'm very excited to speak with him as well. You mentioned him many times. There is a lot going on in this industry, and you're saying controversial. Yes, there's just so much because of the societal issues around cannabis growing. And we're not really going to get into that, but I think it's something that we should talk about more. We usually are talking about the technology and the market and the business, and we do want to touch more on what's going on with people in society, how's it affecting their lives. But for this intents and purposes, because Seth is an investor in the space, we are just really focusing on the business side of things. But please do not think that we do not factor in all the societal issues when it comes to using cannabis.
I would add one just other kind of note to that before we start the interview. California has led the nation and the world in cannabis legalization, though I think that Colorado may have legalized first, but clearly a lot of innovation is happening in California. And New York State has been a cannabis legal state for a very short period of time. And it's still at the point where when a legal dispensary opens, it makes the news. There's a lot of gray market, shady dispensaries that are all over New York City. but the legal ones are the ones that are selling a product that has been verified, probably has been quality controlled. And I'm hoping that Seth talks a little bit about that during this interview.
Yes, lots to talk about. Let's talk to Seth. Here we go.
Hey, Seth, we're super excited to have you today.
I'm super excited to be here. I can't believe that you two want to waste an hour of your listeners' time to talk to me, but I appreciate the flattery.
We love you and we want to give you some love. I'm sure you're going to offer some really interesting answers to our questions that our listeners will appreciate. So that's a big part of the reason that we invited you on. And the big thing is you've got this interesting finance career. You've done a lot of work in the cannabis space, and we want to spend a good chunk of this conversation talking about the impact of biotech, SynBio on cannabis.
Of course, cannabis is the hottest topic. Everybody's really cannabis curious, so they'll want to know a lot about what you've been working on. You have to get started somewhere. You started in finance. So how did you make the transition into life sciences and then cannabis?
I was born into it. You only see further by standing on the shoulders of giants. There's two people in my family who were A-level players in biotech. So my dad started one of the first research products companies that had 70% market share of fundamental molecular biology research until about 1983. My dad passed in 2014, and his cousin, whose name was Gerald Yakatan, was really famous. He's one of three master formulators who created the pharmacology school at UT Austin, and he's probably formulated 12 or 15 products. He had a company called Avenir Pharmaceuticals, which was bought by Otsuka for about $1.2 billion. I was genetically encoded to get involved. For about 15 years, I denied that, and I really wanted to become a venture capitalist myself. I stalked a venture fund until they hired me. Then I went back to graduate school and got an MBA in finance and statistics and went to work in a large bank, essentially underwriting and investing in IPOs for media telecom companies. And it wasn't until about 2001 that I figured that I was not cut out to work at an institution, and I wasn't going to play politics for 20 years of my life. And I founded an advisory firm with my dad that was really focused on biotech, therapeutics, diagnostics, devices, and research products. And that led me into wellness, and it led me into a couple of transactions that serendipitously led me to the therapeutic side of cannabis, which I really focused on from about 2012 to about 2018. And that led me to consumer cannabis in about the middle of 2018. So it's been an evolution, and I continue to do stuff in all of the sectors. So,
Seth, you and I were introduced to each other by your father way back in the day because I had written an article about bioentrepreneurship, and I had talked to your dad for that article. And then he was like, you got to talk to Seth. And then you and I started talking to each other and we hit it off. Biotech is a very broad field. There's a lot of different places where you can apply it. This podcast is about growing everything. But let's talk about the places where you're seeing biotech being applied in the cannabis side.
The original manifestation of that, I think, with me started with another mutual friend of ours who had introduced me to GW Pharmaceuticals. So in about 2004, there was a pretty well-known PR/IR firm that had done professional investor relations and public relations for GW when they did an ADR in the US. And I consumed a lot of cannabis when I was younger. And I said, wow, this is interesting. And I was fascinated by the fact that many of the mechanisms of action inside of cannabis were found endogenously inside of humans.
Seth mentioned cannabis interactions are found endogenously inside of humans. What he is referring to is the endocannabinoid system in the body, which is a vast network of chemical signals and cellular receptors that are densely packed throughout our brains and bodies, with the goal of maintaining homeostasis, or keeping things stable in your body despite changes in the external environment. Cannabinoids have several classes of compounds. There are those that are found in your body working to keep things calm so you can carry on, and those found in plants also known as phytocannabinoids, which we are all familiar with, cannabis plant. Cannabinoids were thought to only be found in the cannabis or hemp plants, but they have been found in many plants like sunflowers, rhododendrons, and liverwort.
I was approached by some investors that basically said the following: we want to do an analog of GW Pharmaceuticals because we want to raise a bunch of money and make a valuable company in Canada. Like, we know how to do that. And I was all ears.
Tell us, what was so pioneering about GW Pharmaceuticals? What was it that made that interesting to you? What does GW do and why they were important in the pharmaceuticalization of cannabis?
GW is interesting for probably two reasons. GW is interesting because it is the bellwether for single small molecule FDA regulated cannabis compound. So they have gotten drug approved where they've taken essentially a plant derived compound, they've extracted it, they've reformatted it, they've crystallized it, and they've used it in a variety of clinical trials for juvenile epilepsy. And they've convinced the FDA that it is a single small molecule and that it is a patented single small molecule. So they've effectively said, this isn't cannabis. Forget about the fact that it's federally illegal. We've taken this molecule through all of these steps to purify it, quantify it, study it. We've now convinced you that it's not cannabis and we can approve it. So there's two things that are interesting about GW, which is that it's the first, it's the only, it's the unicorn. It probably has the single largest IP position around the sector of anyone. And they did parlor trick, for lack of a better description, with the FDA by really getting them to approve something which otherwise would have been federally unapprovable.
What's that compound called? And it's specifically for epilepsy in children, or does it have multiple uses?
Yeah, it's Epidiolex is what it's called. And the other thing that's interesting is that most pharmaceutical approaches to cannabis have largely failed. I listened a lot to some of the really interesting things in your podcast, and I have so many opinions about the true lack of innovation that gets funded. Pharma, in my opinion, tends to move in an extreme herd mentality and also in a Paris Fashion Week mentality, meaning that something's going to get interesting. We're going to throw money at it. It might happen for a minute. And if a product comes out of it, great. And if it doesn't, we're going to move on to the next thing. And cannabis very clearly went down that path. So in the late 80s, mid 90s to 2000s, there was about 5 or 6 pharmaceutical companies who had developed a patented form of either synthetic THC or synthetic CBD or a CB1 or 2 modulator or inhibitor. Azeez was probably the lead among those that took them into a series of pain trials. They all failed. So Marinol, which is synthetic THC, has largely been a failure as a pharmaceutical compound. Pharma has come and gone out of that space. And it's just interesting to take a look at the next generation of what's going to occur there and what might occur there.
Marinol was a synthetic THC product. What was it prescribed for?
Currently, it's prescribed for nausea and cancer cachexia. So it's supposed to be an appetite stimulant. Originally, when it was brought into clinic, it was brought into clinic for a variety of different things. And again, Azeez spent some decent time and money on a compound which they took into pain that didn't work. I think Epidiolex is largely been a commercial success. That company, GW, was acquired by Jazz pretty famously about 2 or 3 years ago. But outside of that landscape, you really don't have a lot in development. I think the future state, which might require 25 to 30 years of development, is you walk into a pharmacy and this product exists. You go to an inkjet printer, it has 25 or 30 different cannabinoids in it. You give them a formulation and it spits out a formulation. I think that will occur. I know that there are anecdotally probably 6 or 7 global wellness practitioners who have developed cannabinoid protocols for critically ill patients. One of them's name is Mara Gordon, who's pretty well known. I know a couple of people in California who do the same thing. And by taking a specific concentration of product in a specific potency with specific kind of QA around it and a specific dosing regimen, I've seen a lot of anecdotally interesting things happen with the compound. So it's very powerful. I just think relative to its ubiquitous use and relative to pharmacovigilance around it and relative to the capability to make claims, we've got a long way to go. Cannabis is very interesting though, because it's so difficult and it it's going to lead me down a very long conversation around two different kind of constraints. So the first constraint that binds cannabis is the same constraint that binds any plant-based molecule, which wants to be federally approved as a therapy. And most pharmaceutical companies are going to require 5 components for a molecule that they're going to develop, which is composition of matter patent, ideally, or some IP, known mechanism of action, safe, repeatable dosing, manufacturing at scale, usually synthetically, and FDA relatable claims. Anytime anyone ever comes to me with a plant-based compound, you have issues along any single one of those areas, and cannabis upregulates every single one of those. So the first problem that you have in the advancement of cannabis as a therapy and as a biologic and as a regulatable product is you can't patent it. You have no idea how it works. Really, the best methodology for delivery is via smoking or inhalation, which is probably the worst way to develop a drug ever. You can't manufacture it efficiently at scale, and it's federally illegal still. The other side of the coin that really inhibits what I think will be the future state of cannabis is funding. I don't recall the statistic, and we probably need to put a footnote that my number is incorrect. But if you read The Emperor of Maladies, it talks about how much capital was put into cancer research by foundations and how there was a philanthropist who moved forward the development of cancer at the NIH, and basically that from 1940 to 1970, I want to say the amount of funding available for cancer research increased 8,000 times at a federal level. And when you think about what we've been able to do as a species in oncology, in pretty much like 4 disease states, you've been able to diagnose, identify, and arrest the development of kind of 4 big parts of that disease. You haven't really been able to cure it, but you've been able to modulate it. And I think that's largely because every single academic research institution on the planet has someone that's researching cancer and is researching the thousands of different permutations of the cancer pathway. If you look at cannabis, it's so complicated, right? You have somewhere between 60 to 165 actives inside of the plant. We really have maybe characterized about 15 or 16 of them. Of those 15 or 16, we've really understand maybe 2 or 3 of them. We really don't know what about 155 of them do. So in addition, what you have inside of the plant occurs via continuous enzymatic expression. What you have in the plant is then phase changed when you light it on fire or extract it into another molecule. And then it's phase changed again when you take it into the body. So if you think about just numbers, which I think about a lot, 160 times 160 times 160 is a gigantic number. And until I think we have dollars around ubiquitous research for the understanding of mechanisms of cannabinoids, you're probably going to be where we're at, which is pretty interesting that McDonald's cheeseburgers level of QA and QC products seem to have an amazing effect, right? Making claims around those effects and then charging pharma prices around those effects is probably where there's a disconnect.
Because a lot of the pharmaceutical companies, they're trying to isolate a compound, maybe change it so that they can get the IP, but then there's like the plant that's grown naturally and has, you mentioned 165 active compounds. And so the practitioners you're talking about, they're not necessarily processing the plant. They're just using the plant that's found in nature, maybe drying it, or I don't know if there's a formulation, but they're not like processing it too much.
It depends,
Okay.
right? It depends upon the user, depends upon the formulation. So in some instances, you have people that are developing whole plant extracts based upon strains that have higher concentrations of specific things. Or sometimes you will have people who will take sole extracts and combine them together in specific concentrations. So the 2 largest are THC and CBD. There's probably 2 groups globally, even till now, who have developed the most clinical data around their strains. There was a group out of Israel called Tikkun Olam that I was involved with for a long time, who had, I think, done 7 open label phase 2As on their strain, which was called Avideco, which is about a 10-to-1 CBD to THC ratio.
Clinical trials are used to test new treatments or interventions. Typically, clinical trials are divided into phases. Phase 0 is looking at how a drug might affect a human at a very low dose. You usually don't have a lot of people in a phase 0 trial. Phase 1 is really about the safety of the product. You're testing to make sure the product itself is not going to be harmful to humans. Then phase 2 is about establishing the efficacy of the drug in a treatment group. Usually you test the drug against placebo. And then phase 3 trials are usually when you are confirming safety and efficacy together. And phase 3 trials tend to be longer and involve a lot more patients. And then finally, once a drug has been cleared by the Food and Drug Administration to be marketed, you often conduct phase 4 trials, which are post-sale safety studies that further study the risks, benefits, and optimal use of a drug. So the FDA prescribes what goes into a clinical trial. Drug companies work very closely with the FDA to design trials. And the system for approving drugs, clearing drugs for marketing in the United States is considered to be the global gold standard.
And in the US, the Stanley brothers were also pretty well known for their Charlotte's Web strain, which kind of had the same properties to it. You're seeing minor cannabinoids like THCA and THCV come up in importance, but given the rarity of them and given the lack of significant funding around them, I haven't seen a ton of incremental clinical detail around them in the past couple of years. To your point, Erum, about single small molecules, and I could spend hours talking about that. I firmly believe a lot of things, and going back to my fashion kind of mentality and herd mentality, I believe in cohorts, and cohorts are really interesting for me for a lot of reasons, probably not the reasons that most people think. But if you look at the psychedelics cohort, which I think has established blossom, peaked, and is now waiting for some level of harvest, I think the reason that psychedelics has regulated into a larger FDA regulated therapeutic cohort than cannabis has is because psychedelic fits the model of pharma much better. I can take a single small molecule, I can patent it. If I'm smart, I can probably synthesize that molecule synthetically. I can dose it. It's probably not federally illegal and has the historical legacy of being a devil plant that cannabis has. And I can figure out a way to probably market it for a super untreatable, super rare, super complicated disorder and get people to get charged a lot of money for it. You have 4 companies there where everyone's waiting, 2 of which are in the lead, one of which had a pretty decent sized clinical failure. And since then, as you can see, pharma's like sitting there going, okay, like watching a polo match. Yeah, okay, I'll wait till the 4th round and then maybe I'll place a bet and wait for this guy to fall off his horse and break a leg and all that kind of stuff. Hopefully you'll see that in cannabis. I just don't know that you will, at least not for a while.
One of the things you mentioned, Seth, was this idea of people prescribing. You mentioned specifically Tikkun, Olam, and their strains, and the Stanley brothers also with their strains. But how does it change the cannabis industry in general? And we'll come back to biotech, but how does the industry change as strains are better characterized? What are people doing to breed certain characteristics into strains? And then in the future, when the endocannabinoids that are available, whatever the 160, how do things change when those are easily available, say through synthetic biology, where you're able to brew them all?
There's so many things in that question. So let's unpack it into kind of 3 areas. All right. Let's talk about the difference between the consumer market and what I would call the pharmaceutical market. Given the constraints that exist on cannabis federally and globally from a research perspective, I candidly think you're, other than maybe one other company like GW, I think you're a generation away from having real pharma advancement. Okay. You don't know enough about the plant. There's not enough money available for it. The other thing, if you look at the discrepancy between those 2 markets, pharmaceutical drug development isn't really driven upon saving human lives. Pharmaceutical drug development is driven by developing 10 compounds in a portfolio, so 2 of them turn into billion-dollar drugs. You don't have that going on in cannabis. Like, that's not going to work, given constraint number 1. Binding that constraint is the fact that you have a $60 billion global market for a plant that seems to put you to sleep and seems to take away pain and seems to do that anecdotally. I think if you're trying to sell a consumer A5 Wagyu ribeye for $4,000 an ounce, and they can go down the street and they can get ground beef for $2 an ounce, they're going to buy ground beef for a long period of time. Okay. So I think you have that as one kind of binding constraint. That being said, I think what you're seeing in the strain development side is now, because of the strength of what I would call the non-pharma or the recreational market, what you have being grown is you have product that seems to appeal to consumer demand as opposed to clinical demand. And what happens with consumer demand is that things like color and THC potency and appeal inside of the packaging drive consumption way more than effect, right? So although flower is still probably the largest component of the sales in market at anywhere between 40 to 50% of the US, people seem to be getting effect from different form factors than flower. They seem to be getting effect from things like gummies and beverages. And I think you'll continue to see that transition. So I don't know that the strain development necessarily enhances what I would call pharmacovigilance or claim making around product. But I do think that as you start to see consumer uptake and anecdotal efficacy out of incremental form factors, you will start to see more innovation there. So two examples of that are 4 or 5 years ago, there was the discovery or coming out of a compound called CBN. CBN is now used in every single gummy, in every single tincture for sleep. It's the sleep compound. The onset of CBN into sleep, I think, was one of the interesting developments that have come out. The other thing that I think you've seen come out is the notion of either low dose or beverages in low dose. People seem to be able to regulate dose via a session of consumption, and taking a 2 to 4 to 6 to 8 milligram product seems to allow you to go out, be social, have an effect for an hour, not be hungover, not have a deleterious effect from the product. So I think what you're seeing more in development is creating product that anecdotally complies with consumer demand as opposed to the pharmaceutical side of it. There's also a problem with that. There's a huge lack of traditional pharmacovigilance in the cannabis space. No matter how much I'm going to belittle pharma for lack of innovation, they're very good at QC and QA. As an example, I'm in Los Angeles, you're in New York. If we both went to a CVS right now and we bought a bottle of Tylenol, and we both sent it simultaneously to a testing lab in Sandusky, Ohio, that's going to be exactly the same product. Okay. You have illegally obtained bodega California brands that have legally been exported out of California or produced in California, sitting at a bodega a block from where you're at in New York City right now. I have the same product a block from where I'm at in California now. If we sent that product to the same testing lab, it's not going to be the same product. There's no way. Okay. So until we fix that problem, I think you have difficulty in the development of real claim-based innovation or pharmaco-based innovation in cannabis. There's one more thing that you brought up, which is synth biology. I am the biggest fan of synth biology. I am the biggest fan of your show. I've geeked out on a lot of things that you've had on and gone into rabbit holes of hours of research on the internet. I don't invest a lot of my own capital because I'm really bad at it. And one of the things that I invested the most money into and lost the most money into was a synth bioeconomy expression technology. To talk about these waves and waves of fashion, I've probably seen synth bio in some way, shape, or form be transposed or superimposed onto an existing production methodology 3 or 4 times in the last 20 or 30 years that I've been doing this, most notably in petroleum and in cannabis. And what seems to happen is that in each of those instances, you get really close to be able to synthetically produce product at the same cost as you can either extract it out of the earth or grow it and extract it out of the earth, but you never get lower than that. And I think until you have a synth bio platform from an expression perspective that's able to produce cannabinoids significantly cheaper than you can extract it, which I think is going to take a long time, I'm not sure that those business models are ever really going to pencil.
Have you seen other companies, though, going after it? Any other cannabis and bio companies since you kind of
Sure.
have eyes on the
There-
space?
There's a cohort of probably the last time I checked, 10 to 12 companies that are doing that. At one point in my life, I was one of the world experts in that space. And there's one or two public companies that are doing it. There's a few private companies that are still doing it. And they all either take a transfection approach, a bacterial approach, or in some case, an enzymatic approach. It's basically molecular biology, just depending upon the approach. None of them have succeeded. There's a very famous one that I think is now out of business, which was called Tiwanot Life Sciences, which raised, 70 or 80 million dollars in kind of the first cannabis wave that never succeeded in the commercial development of a product. But there's definitely a few of them still out there.
Are they making THC? It's the compound that they're striving to synthetically produce.
It depends. There are a number of what they call rares out there. And I think the general thought process is if you could produce a rare that at scale in a way that was easier or cheaper than producing it from the plant, that there's market for that. I don't know that anyone has successfully been able to do that. Delta 9 THC is pretty well known. CBD is pretty well known. CBN is one that seems to be able to be expressed, but you have things like THCV and CBGA and CBDA and CBDV that are pretty interesting. So I've been involved with a few of those companies. One of them has shifted more, I think, into petroleum production than anything else because they definitely take a enzymatic based approach to what they are doing. That company is called Invizyne. Invizyne. That's one that I think, to the extent that the sector is going to be successful, will be. They take just a cell-free approach to it, which is interesting, and are involved in several different markets, including flowers and fragrances and pharma. But there's definitely 6 or 8 of them that are still out there doing it.
Seth mentioned a cell-free approach to manufacturing flowers, fragrances, and pharmaceuticals. So what is cell-free biomanufacturing? Well, there are many forms of using biology to manufacture products. And traditionally, it ranged from growing plants, like in agriculture, to raising animals and using cells to produce specific products. Cell-free biomanufacturing doesn't use entire cells. It uses the components of a cell that are responsible for producing a product. So you don't spend time and money cultivating and nourishing cells to keep them alive. Cell-free biomanufacturing is a growing area of interest and investment, and we'll speak to some experts on cell-free in the future. So you mentioned a bunch of different compounds that these synthetic biology cannabis companies are attempting to produce. It's probably really early stage, but have they made a claim or are they targeting specific effects? So I know CBN is for sleepiness or relaxation. Are these compounds maybe designed for some other effect like energy or reducing anxiety or depression? Are they aiming for a certain claim or just trying to produce it and see what happens?
I think in some instances, they're really just, to be quite honest with you, trying to produce it and see what happens more than anything. I think out of these, you call it 25 or 30 rares, there's a decent amount known about 3 or 4 of them. So CBD and THC Delta 9 are probably the 2 that are the best characterized in the best studies. When you look at something like CBC, that's a compound which has inhibited cancer cell growth in models, it has reduced inflammation in cell models, it has promoted bone growth in cell models, and is a pain reliever. CBC is a compound that I think people think has clinical promise. Isolating it is expensive, studying it is challenging. CBGA, which is another one, reduces inflammation, reduces pain, and seems to also slow bacterial growth. THCV, which is one that I think is interesting, also promotes bone growth and reduces convulsions and seizures, and also seems to have a decent effect in diabetes. So when you go into the literature and you look at them, some of them largely, if you characterize them, have anti-proliferation compound activities. Some of them have anti-oncology or lysing oncology cell activities. Some of them have reduction of inflammation activities. Some of them have pain activities. Some of them have sleep activities. Some of them have appetite suppression or upregulation. So when you look at those 5 or 6 key areas, that seems to be where they work. I think you're still very early in the manifestation of clinical claims around them.
On the one hand, Seth, what I keep thinking about is the fact that cannabis prohibition lasted approximately 70 years. Ostensibly, there was no research that went on during that time. So we have to make up for 70 years worth of research into the plant and the compounds that it produces. On the other hand, some of the compounds that you mentioned are showing up in consumer products. I'm thinking specifically about gummies, where sleep gummy, CBD, THC, THCV, CBN, people are putting those into those and they're making vitamin-like claims. I think what they're doing is they're kind of like playing more off of it's generally safe. Here's what vitamins do. It's still largely unregulated, still very much of an experiment going on there. But as long as nobody's getting hurt by these things, people are taking advantage of, I'm going to say the gray area or whatever it is, but the fact that these compounds are available and lend themselves to make these kinds of claims. What does that look like in the future? Let's say someone cracks down on the vitamin industry. What's it going to do to all these CBD products that have THC in them or THC products that purport to be for a specific effect?
I think you have to unpack that into 2 different ways, and this becomes even more confusing. Any product that you find outside of a dispensary, unless it's an illegal dispensary, is a hemp-derived product. It's not a cannabis-derived product. So if you walk into CVS, for example, there's probably going to be a CBD gel cap on the shelf. That is a product that is derived from Farm Bill compliant hemp, usually with less than a very specific percentage of THC in it. That bill is going to be up for reevaluation in September. I don't think it's going to largely change that market. So you have a large swath of consumer product, which is non-cannabis and federally compliant, which I think is being consumed by a number of people and is fairly ubiquitously available. I don't know that it has an amazing effect, but it's there. You also have a class of product now, which has come up in the Delta 8 and Delta 9 and Delta 10 area, which has gotten a little bit of press lately, that very clearly is Farm Bill compliant, hemp derived, and it has an effect. If you take a 15 or a 20 milligram Delta 8 or Delta 9 hemp derived THC gummy, your face is going to be numb. So to your first question, I think that there's a segment of market that doesn't change. The question really is what happens if or when federal regulation changes surrounding cannabinoid-derived products or cannabis-derived products. And I don't know that I know the answer to that question, to be candid with you. That's probably the reason why I've gotten into cannabis. You have a $60 billion market that's growing at an 18.5% CAGR that's been regulated on a state-by-state basis in 30 separate states and growing to more. I don't know what the number is today. Maybe it's close to 35. And I don't think that you're going to see a federal change. And if we have one corollary for this event, it's the deregulation of alcohol. And you still have states like Massachusetts and Pennsylvania and New Hampshire that regulate the consumption, taxing, and distribution of alcohol in different fashions. It's Pennsylvania or New Hampshire, I can't remember. You have to buy all of your liquor at a state-controlled liquor store. If Biden falls out of bed tomorrow and decides to legalize cannabis, does that mean that you're having trucks of cannabis from California being shipped to New York tomorrow? I don't think so. Does it also mean that a state like Idaho, which has basically said no cannabis here ever, is going to hand in ammunition and guns and then just decide that, okay, bring cannabis and it's cool? I don't know.
I think it's an interesting question because we haven't heard anything about national legalization in a while.
The big thing is that cannabis people know that you smoke a flower. You mentioned gummies. There's a lot of baked goods coming out. There's dispensaries opening here in New York City. But have you seen any unique applications, not just like consuming cannabis, maybe topical or like other uses? And what do you think we'll see in the dispensary 5 years from now?
Most interesting thing that I've probably seen, to be candid, is SKU level product innovation in form factor development. There's a company that I'm a big fan of out of California, which is called Level Pro Tabs. So Level has a self-dissolving tablet, a sublingual effectively, that is packaged with usually specific effect or specific product orientation in mind. It's a very good company. I don't have any affiliation with it, but I know it's done as it relates to cannabis probably better than most. And I think that's a company, when I look at how are we going to get away from flower and vapes, doing things where you are able to market more for effect than you are for just feeling a certain way. I think that's where you go. Level's a company that advertises product for energy, creativity, socialization, relief, calm, sleep. That's one of the companies that I think from a form factor perspective definitely moves in that direction. There's another company which is multi-state that kind of has the same vibe. It's called 1906. So 1906 effectively has 5 or 6 different tablets or edible hard type of candy, self-dissolving pill, almost like a sweet tart, where they orient them for specific effect: energy, happiness, brain power, arousal, relaxation, sleep. I think from the innovations perspective, that's where I've seen the most innovation. I got into cannabis because I thought it was going to be a lot easier than biotech. It's a lot harder. And again, given kind of the federal constraints on it and the problems around pharmacovigilance and the problems around how difficult it is to make money and the problems around the black market, I think what you're going to see is more and more products like this that begin to get larger consumer uptake. I also think we've seen a lot of innovation in the beverage space. Full disclosure, we're really involved, my partner and I, in a company called Cann, which is a leading low-dose beverage provider. I think we've seen some interesting things in the emulsions there. We've seen some interesting things in the cannabinoid ratios there: 4 milligrams of THT and SU of CBD in one 10-ounce can or 8-ounce can to have an effect. There's a company that I'm observing in California called Uncle Arnie's, which has a 100 milligram product. It's a 100 milligram iced tea. And, I kind of liken that to an Everclear product. It doesn't have a humongous clinical effect. It does in a direction, but from a consumer perspective, if you're a 22-year-old kid and you go into a dispensary and you got $20 and they have a buy two, get one free, and you walk out of there with 300 milligrams of active product and you walk into a party, you're a popular human being at that point. I think we're seeing it more on that line than really honestly true product innovation. Again, I just want to use the analogy of, selling $400 an ounce Wagyu A5 beef doesn't really work when you can buy the same thing for $1. And the pressures in the black market make that even harder. So I also think we've seen some things in the sleep market. There's a product in California, which is called Dreamt, that came out of a lab at UCLA that seems to have a bunch of interesting sleep formulations. I think as you begin to get deeper into beverage consumption, sleep and effect are where you're probably going to see major winners in cannabis. You've definitely seen people develop novel form factors like infused pre-rolls and things like that, but that's a completely different direction.
Circling back to biotech, when you talk to cannabis people about biotechnology, what do they say to you? What's the reaction, or how do you explain it to them? Why does it matter for them to even have a modicum of understanding of what biotech offers?
Well, normally people just want me to give them lead, to be candid. Normally the conversation starts off where they say, wow, either I really don't use products, so let's just talk about pharmaceutical stuff, or do you have any gummies? Or what do you think of this product? It's usually a good conversation starter, and just the kind of things that you see on a monthly basis in the cannabis business, you just lose your mind. Just the volume and the size of things are enormous. I think where I really go is in a different direction, Karl. I just see so many interesting corollaries between the industries. That's usually what I focus on. And it's probably the reason that I got into cannabis, and maybe the reason that I've been allegedly successful in cannabis, because I don't really think I've done anything. But where I tend to focus is on the same general sets of issues that underlie biotech companies or companies in the life sciences tend to underlie cannabis companies. So what are they? The first is that you have two pretty young industries. Biotech, if we're going to call it that, or even kind of industrial pharmaceutical life sciences, is maybe a 40 to 50-year-old industry. Like biotech started in 1973. It's 2023. So you want to call it 40 or 50 years old? Okay, it's a 50-year-old industry. Cannabis is a 15-year-old industry, maybe. So that's one similarity. The second similarity is they're both impossibly capital constrained. So what you always hear in cannabis biotech is, how are we going to raise money? How are we going to raise money? How are we going to raise money? Why? Because the number, the N, the capital N of investors that is available to biotech institutionally, globally, is maybe 1,000. Maybe I'm being generous. Maybe it's 600. Maybe it's somewhere in between that number. Can we footnote the notes to the podcast? Can I get a research analyst to figure out what that number is, please? Thank you. Because we'd need to know that. Same thing in cannabis, except maybe that number is 35 or 50. You don't also have public access to cannabis capital anymore. You also don't have any strategic or financial buyers in cannabis whatsoever. So your zone in cannabis is literally you're skating around the same hockey rink with the same people all the time. You're not leaving. So the capital constraint mindset in both is overwhelmingly similar. They both require incredible amounts of capital for different reasons. Biotech requires incredible amounts of capital because what you do is you usually take a pallet of money and you liquefy it. You incinerate it. And what you do is you hope to get a signal. You don't hope to get a product. You don't hope to generate revenue. You don't hope to commercial. You hope to get a signal. Cannabis is different. It's really hard to make money. It's hard to make money because the federal government imposes a rule on cannabis companies called 280E, which was the tax rule that they used to arrest Al Capone. And basically what it does, it takes most components of a P&L and doesn't allow you to subtract them as expense. So your marginal operating cost as a cannabis company, when you add back 280E, is about another 20 to 30%, depending upon how you operate. So the business models that generate cash flow, which is not a lot in cannabis, are extremely limited. So both of them have extreme appetites for capital for different reasons. They're both extremely regional. If you're a biotech company or a life science company, and Karl and I had this discussion a couple of weeks ago, and you're in Paris, France, and you're a French company, you're raising money in France, and that's it. If you're lucky, you might get a crossover investor from Germany or Italy or Scandinavia, but pretty much that's it. You're not coming to Sand Hill Road and raising money. Okay, cannabis, you can pretty much operate in the state that you're operating in, and if you're one of the 7 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers that's figured out how to access public capital and has gone multi-state, okay, you can operate in the constraints of that state, but you're finite and you're constrained. And usually your investor base is finite and constrained. And they both have an incredible amount of opportunity for different reasons. In biotech, you're potentially saving lives. And what you're really looking to do is to hopefully develop something to improve process. In cannabis, you're helping lives and you're sailing into an amazingly robust and ever-changing and growing market. So they have so many similarities. And for me, they're both really interesting. Most people that are exceptionally scientifically gifted and have been able to do fundamental research have no idea how to raise money and transact. And someone who has spent years perfecting a very high quality craft cultivated consumer product doesn't understand intramarket fluctuations of pricing and economies of scale and profitability. So the same kind of market discipline that I've employed in a number of biotech companies, I found to be valuable in cannabis. So rather than talk about how the industries interplay, I tend to talk about how the fact that they're both so similar, and that biotech, for me, to be candid, is a corollary to a stepping stone of where cannabis could potentially go. Now, full disclosure, I work with a company and for a company called the Glasshouse Group. The Glasshouse Group has the second largest contiguous greenhouse on the planet. They're growing very high quality greenhouse flower. And I think as per their latest analyst report, they're able to produce that flower for something like $130 a pound.
Yeah.
And last year, I think they threw off something on the order of 170,000 pounds of flower. They're going to go through a process to turn on their second greenhouse, which is another 1 million square feet that will probably bring total production in that facility of the 2 greenhouses to something on the order of 300,000 to 350,000 pounds of flower a year.
So does that make them the biggest producer in California?
They're right up there. The point that I wanted to make for Erum, though, is that you do not ever need to build another grow or processing facility anywhere in the United States from Tuesday, February 21st, 2003 forward. All of the required capacity is there and exists. And I think the reason that I say I'm going to stay in California is that if you look at cannabis as opposed to one global market as individual markets, right, there's not a clear leader here yet. And there hasn't been a significant amount of consolidation or external M&A activity. So if you have the capacity, at least in one product or one company, to supply most most of the Western United States. And if they get that down to below, call it $80 a pound, there's not too many people that are ever going to be able to compete at that level. They're going to have such a first mover advantage that I think for me, focusing on what's here is probably strong enough. There's another company that is public, which is called Forefront Ventures, that operates in about 5 states, California, Illinois, Massachusetts, and 2 others I just don't remember. They have a processing facility in Southern California in Commerce, which I want to say is 188,000 square feet. It's one of the largest facilities I've ever been in for any reason. Outside of Hershey, Pennsylvania, they have the largest confectionery manufacturing line in the world. So to your point, the infrastructure exists. People have built it. It just needs to be utilized. And I think the triggering event for that is, does it go federally legal? And can you utilize all of that capacity that exists to take it other places? What tends to also happen in cannabis is that because of that super regional requirement, people tend to spend a lot of money in capital expenditures to overbuild things in regions. So as an example, Michigan, which has been in the news as one of these kind of up and down markets. Euphoria came in 2 years ago when Michigan started to go rec. I've been to 3 or 4 facilities in Michigan that could probably supply and process for the entire Midwest. And I know 2 of them are closed. You have these gold rush mentalities in cannabis where markets come online and people run really fast to try and create infrastructure and capacity to meet projected demand versus building to the capacity that they need. And that's a common mistake that I've seen oftentimes.
We talked about pharmaceutical companies, like those are like the big giants, but what about other big consumer companies getting into the cannabis space? I have a million questions about this in bio. I know that it's not really taken off, but we'll get there maybe in another episode. But I heard Philip Morris is getting in the game, like these legacy industries. Smoking isn't as cool as it used to be. Like smoking cigarettes, nicotine, for them to de-risk. Are they going into the cannabis game? Are there any other big consumer companies getting into the game?
People are coming in. They're largely waiting on the sidelines. So you saw Constellation Brands make a very large investment into, I believe it was Tilray. And that seemed to be like, okay, it's happening. I've heard of pharmaceutical and tobacco companies creating think tanks and creating infrastructure in Canada. Hasn't largely materialized. There is a NYSE listed public company called Turning Point Brands that owns the Zigzag paper line and also hypothecated a transaction to make an investment into a national flower brand called Old Pal. I also know that there are several people in the beverage industry, families, usually in the liquor distribution business, that have made investments into beverage companies and have also made investments into sales agencies. There's a cohort of maybe 1 or 2 outsourced sales agencies that on behalf of a brand will take a product into a dispensary multi-state. So you're seeing it. But everyone's waiting. And I think they're waiting for probably 2 things. They're waiting for federal change because from a charter perspective, most corporations, financial institutions, investment banks, funds, keep going down that list, have a morality clause somewhere in their operating agreement that says they can't invest formally into a federally illegal industry. So I think once that requirement gets altered or shifted, you're going to see so much money flow into cannabis. I think the second part is that one of the reasons that I think a lot of people are still waiting is that you don't really have a bona fide proven playbook for how to be successful in cannabis. You have micro playbooks, you have certain segments where people are generating cash flow, but not a lot and not many of them. So I also think that when you start to look at traditional M&A or pharma-based M&A, traditional M&A is we're going to take something which is generating cash flow or has a consumer base that we don't have. We're going to plug it into our infrastructure and we're going to be able to grow it. Or we're going to option a molecule because we know how to develop it better than they do. And it's going to cost us less. And if we get it approved, we don't have to pay them as much. That doesn't necessarily work. Where you're probably going to see consolidation initially is most likely beverage and most most likely what I think is asset-light brands that have market share and are generating revenue and cash flow. That's where I think you're going to see it. Beverage seems to be, I want to say a no-brainer, but beverage seems to be the easiest way to do it. You already have an existing infrastructure. You already have an existing sales channel. You already have the same consumer base. It's destigmatized. And in places like Minnesota, you're currently in a loophole where you can sell cannabis beverages anywhere. So I think that's probably where you're going to see it first. The other place that you might see it is outsourced manufacturing firms. That seems to be a vertical that has gotten a lot of play in the chip space, in the bio space, in the biomanufacturing space, in the CRO space, where someone does something really well for a variety of people. As an example, there's a company in California that generates a lot of revenue and generates a lot of cash flow and manufactures pre-rolls for a lot of people. So I think that's something where you say, okay, that you could see how that could get bought. There's also two other models that I think are really ones which will get bought to the extent they want to sell, which are the we do everything. There's a group called Mammoth Distribution in Los Angeles where they own about 10 or 15 brands and they don't grow biomass, but they do just about everything else from the extraction to the product manufacturing to the distribution, which is a whole separate conversation, to the sales, service, and collection in store. And that's a traditional vertically integrated product manufacturing company that generates revenue and cash flow. There's another one in California called Falcon. And I think companies like those two are ones that will probably be at the leading edge of either acquiring and consolidating or being acquired and consolidated because they fit traditional kind of private equity ethoses.
Yeah. So we're going to see Pepsi cannabis drinks eventually.
Maybe. I think what you're going to see is you're going to see things on the shelf next to existing beverages first. So if we just use Can and Uncle Arnie's, the AYR group bought a pretty well-known beverage in the Northeast called Levia that as you see this move in society towards functional beverages and seltzers and session drinking and requirement for no calories, right? If you would have told me 4 years ago or 6 years ago that White Claw or the hard seltzer segment would be as big as it is, we probably wouldn't have been able to prognosticate that. If you think about those market dynamics as it relates to cannabis, a product like Can probably perfectly fits into that distribution methodology, channel, and strategy. A product like Uncle Arnie's probably does as well on the opposite side of that spectrum. But if you think about the 6 or 8 major liquor distribution companies that exist and those hegemonies that exist in the United States, I think it's pretty conceivable that if the walls come crumbling down, that one of the first people that is knocking on the door of a beverage company is a Southern Wine and Spirits or a Diageo, because that's what they do, right? If you look at something like Bullet and the story behind Bullet, some guy at a liquor distribution company said, hey, this segment isn't being served. He went out and he started the company. It generated $30 million in revenue. He got bought, right? So I think you will see that just because it seems to me to be the easiest integratable domino to fall.
That makes sense. There's two things I wanted to talk about. One is like traditional synbio, where your bioengineering plants to be like drought resistant and to be able to grow in different conditions. But then like the synthetic biology that we're all jazzed about is that you can create different functionality in different compounds within a plant or a product that can, besides just reducing anxiety or increasing appetite, you can have some type of advanced or enhanced experience when it comes to creativity. So there's two types of engineering when it comes to synthetic biology and plants that I would love for you to talk about.
Cannabis is very skewed more in strain towards better production capability because the metrics of your typical grow weed out things which might have greater effect. If you're in a large grow, you're constraining your grow cycle for bag appeal, consumer demand. Also, how much dry weight of product do I get off of one single plant? How long is it going to take me to get that plant to grow? How far out in the canopy is that plant going to spread? How many human factors am I going to have in the plant? How many other plants can I fit in the row? What's my yield? Okay. So your typical industrialized cannabis facility is constraining towards those requirements. Because if it was constraining towards other requirements, you would probably grow a product that might have a different or a better effect, but it doesn't yield as much and it costs too much to produce. And I don't get the same kind of economics that I get out of that first batch of products. There's a strain that my friend Karl might be familiar with called Red Congolese. Red Congolese is a landrace strain, which is one of the original strains which kind of came about. It's a very high functioning sativa. It's almost like ADHD kind of medication. It's a super heady, super high functioning, super creative product. We have 3 companies that run on Red Congolese. There's one guy in California who grows Red Congolese indoor, and he usually grows it twice a year. Why? Because it spreads out. He gets 2.7 to 3.2 pounds of light versus 4 pounds of light for something that he can put in a bag and grow. And the kind of people that are going to pay for that product, he's got to go and onesie twosie out what they call packs or pounds of product to get it to sell. He loses a growth cycle out of it, and it takes him 4 months to sell the Red Congo. He could go grow OG Sherb cream or whatever he's growing now, which everyone wants to buy, and he could probably double the yield and cut the sales cycle by 80%. So to your point, we haven't gotten into the level yet where outside of super craft, super high quality cultivators, you have people that are really growing for effect or for outcome or for bio outcome. Rather, you're growing to market demand.
You mentioned this earlier in the conversation about the constraints of engineering plants for enhancement. Can you create a flower that actually tastes like chocolate because you're intentionally programming that DNA to do that?
So when you're getting into the pheno hunting space,
Yeah.
you are getting people who are engineering for specific terpene profiles for taste or flavor. Usually when you go through a pheno hunt to constrain for a flavor, a taste, or a color, you're doing that also in the context of all the other things we talked about. How much is it going to yield? How much is it going to impact my other crop in rotation? How much is the consumer going to want it? So what you usually find in those pheno-specific flavor or taste profile products, they're usually short runs and they usually come in quickly because what they want to do from a grow perspective is they want to get that pheno that they know in there is going to pop product irregardless of what happens, right? Growth of cannabis at scale is really interesting because every single grow has mini microclimates inside of each of it. And a master grower really doesn't want to change anything in that protocol because what they want is they pretty much want the most optimal, if not the shortest grow time and the most yield. So doing anything to change that 5,000 square foot or 3,000 square foot microenvironment with a new plant is a risk, and it's a risk to the entire rest of your crop. So people are usually doing a pheno-based taste or flavor product on what they call an R&D room or on a smaller scale because they don't want whatever their legacy product is to be able to do that. As an example of that, there's a very well-known brand in California that I'm a big fan of called Pacific Stone that grows greenhouse product. They have about 8 strains, and I am one of the few people who has actually been in the entirety of that facility. And that facility is overwhelming because it's the size of a small stadium. And in one facility, all they do is grow and process one thing. So you have the mothers, they clone them, they grow them into teens, they put them in the grow room, they harvest them, they process them. So in one facility, they're only doing one strain at a time because they don't want to have anything to violate either the sanctity of that strain, the economics that they have of the production, or essentially the constitution of the facility. There's something else that I feel like I need to discuss in the context of synth bio, which is that one of the questions that I always ask myself when I evaluate a company is, does it deserve to be a company? Is there enough here? Is it novel, and where does it fit in a cohort, or is it incremental? Does it deserve to be a company? Is there a risk reward scenario where you could see developing this into a revenue stream? A lot of things in synth bio are awesome ideas, and they need to be researched, but they don't substantiate the basis of being a company. So some of the things that you see in the context of cannabis farming, most of those decisions are less about what does this mean for the environment? What does it mean for the input factors of the product? It means often more about I'm fighting for survival because this is such a difficult market and I need to grow as much product as I possibly can that's going to sell at the highest price. Sometimes that right thing to do logic is counterintuitive to the way that the real business works. So.
Yeah. And then who's bypassing the plant altogether then? Because we know that synthetic biology has that promise of you don't have to necessarily grow things in terms of agriculture and growing plants. Are there any companies that are developing cannabis compounds?
So I mentioned a company earlier called InDesign, which is very clearly bypassing the plant or attempting to bypass the plant. There's another company, which I believe still exists in California, called Celebre, which is attempting to do the same thing, where they are taking designer microbes to make products. And if you go on their website, you can allegedly buy, CBG, CBA, CBDA, CBDV, CBN, THC from them. That's completely formed in a synthetic process. And that will come, right? That will come. I spent a lot of time looking at the biology of the plant. So when I was starting to look at pharma and pharma cannabis, I was like, gosh, the end state of this should be like you do in any other kind of mechanized, industrialized global product like rubber or opioids. The end state of this should be, we should grow this in a lab, right? That should be the end state, because what I want is I want to have bioequivalent, plant equivalent product, irregardless of where it's grown or what concentration it's grown in. And what's the best way to do that? One way is transfection. The other way is to find a vector. The other way is to manipulate bacteria. What I tried to do is I tried to effectively use a cell-free process by duplicating via constant enzymatic reaction what happened to the plant. That exists. It works. It functions. There's two problems. The first problem is that once you get it beyond a liter scale, it becomes pretty expensive. So for me to go buy a liter of extracted THC in California used to be a couple $1,000. I don't know what it is now. I would bet you, and I haven't got a price, but somewhere between 50 and $100. So if I called one of my guys and I was like, hey, can you drop off a liter of THC extract or distillate? It's not hard to get and it's cheap. If that same product is 10 times the cost from a synth bio provider, you don't have the clinical utility or the QC QA pharmacovigilance around it. Where it starts to become interesting is the intersection of those products in the rare cannabinoids and the requirement for people to want to research them. So if I went out and I wanted to get a liter of THCV, it doesn't exist. And if it exists, maybe it's 50 grand. So could you express THCV in a lab and get a liter of it? Maybe. I don't know how much it would cost. And it would probably take you a while to sell it. But I think the intersection of where synth bio goes is into that, and the end state eventually, like you've seen with opioids and like you saw with aspirin and like you've seen with rubber, is that at some point, some usually incredibly smart chemist will figure out how to synthesize it in a lab and scale it. And I think that's where it's going to eventually go. What you're going to have is you're going to have an intersection where the cost of that product makes sense from a manufacturing perspective versus what you sell it at. And right now, it just doesn't, because you have so much biomass available.
Right.
Is there anything else that we should know before we wrap up today?
I'm super honored to be on. I really appreciate you taking the time. I can't believe that there's a single person who really wants to listen to what I have to say, but happy to be a resource for you guys and promote what you're doing. And think you're really onto something. Karl constantly shows me the most cutting edge stuff and the coolest stuff. And I think that you guys are forging into an amazing vertical. And when you're ready to do a fund, we should talk.
Wow, that was an incredible interview. Seth is so knowledgeable. It's clear that a lot more people are interested in the cannabis space. Seth brought up a couple of points where you could go into a CVS and you're going to find CBD gummies that are probably manufactured from the hemp plant. But he touched upon so many interesting things. What was your biggest takeaway, Erum?
I had many, and we can discuss some highlights, but I did want to say that I feel like Seth, in the most nicest way, is like the Mr. Wonderful of cannabis investing. Like he just knows so much. And I feel like he probably doesn't take shit, and he can see things clearly because he has the scientific background and the finance background. He says in the podcast, like he was born to do this. There's no one else in the world that can do what Seth does. It's just really interesting to see how biotech can touch different parts of the process or the industry when it comes to either production or creating different, Seth used the term pheno hunters, which I like, but what other functionality that you can create using synthetic biology. There are challenges that he brought up, but this industry is growing, and hopefully there's other companies like the cohorts he mentioned, companies that can work together to grow this industry.
Yeah, I think one of the key takeaways from the conversation is that cannabis is an extremely complicated plant. It's a complicated industry, just like biotech is a complicated industry. And, what we're trying to do here on Grow Everything is simplify things so that more people get inspired, understand what these industries are and how they are impacting our daily lives. I always had a picture that one of the ways that biotechnology would impact the cannabis industry would just be this idea of being able to synthesize the active ingredients. Seth mentioned there was 160 of them. And once you had access to those, you would be able to pick and choose which ones you would use to create a product with a specific effect, which I think we have yet to see. So I think that's a really interesting thing to think about, is how do you use biotechnology to scale the production of ingredients that are rare in nature? And this is something that we see happening in the personal care and beauty space as well. They're out there looking for ingredients that are in very small quantities that normally you would have had to grow a lot of plants to extract rose oil, for example. Now you don't have to do that. You can do that in the lab. And I think we will see a lot of that in the cannabis industry.
The effects, I think, are just very interesting because there's already a market for that.
Yeah.
In dispensaries, they'll label it as reducing stress, reducing anxiety, increasing appetite. And they have actually like different vibes and stuff like that. It's already there. Is it proven? What is the feedback loop? Because he mentioned one company that does everything from extraction to making the formulations and the packaging and distribution and everything. But what about consumer feedback or the consumer engagement? Like, does it really do what it says it does? Because we have this endocannabinoid system in our bodies, but we're all very different. When Seth mentioned, okay, you can go to a pharmacy and get some type of cannabis product, wouldn't it be cool if you can just get an assessment? I don't know how you measure or get like a snapshot of your endocannabinoid system, if that's something that's possible. If I'm sounding crazy to people that know more than me, I'm sorry. But if there was a way to be able to get an assessment and say, actually, this is the cannabis product that would be best for you.
For this effect, yeah.
For this effect. And so it's like personalized cannabis. Whoa.
Yeah, but I think that speaks to this. Again, it's like biology is very complicated. And I think I just saw like a headline that talked about functional food menus. Once we understand your genetic makeup and we know what foods keep you healthy, you could be prescribed those foods, or you would just know that those are the foods that are going to keep you healthy, help you lose weight, help you gain muscle, whatever the effect that you wanted. And I think that the same thing could work really nicely in the cannabis industry. I think there is a missing feedback loop, which, yeah, you could probably go mine multiple websites where people are posting reviews of products. But I think that is one of those things, like Seth says, is part of the reason why that industry has yet to be pharmaceuticalized. So there's a lot of opportunity, but I do think that he was very good at explaining what makes cannabis and biotech both difficult, and then also what that intersection is between the two of them.
Yeah. And what's coming out in the industry. I love the fact that he shared some of those products, the beverage industry really being that form factor that cannabis can be deployed in. I thought that was really not funny, maybe scary, where he talked about the 100 milligram drink.
Yeah, that's crazy.
That sounds pretty intense, because I think what's being sold in dispensaries is probably lower dose, like 5 to 10 milligrams. So this would be 100, 10x.
If you're using any of these products for the first time, please be very careful.
Yeah. And that's the thing. If it's going to be a beverage sold, and he mentioned college students, so I don't know, that seems pretty young to be able to do things responsibly. Not to discount college students. I know there's a lot of responsible college students out there, but still there's some, like, maybe that 100 milligram drink should just be 10 milligram drinks. And if people want to get that super effect, they can drink some more, right? Not necessarily making it easy for them to get lit. Is that what the kids say?
Yeah. No, I think there's a lot to be said and learned. And I just thought it was a fascinating interview. And I hope that our audience appreciates it and enjoyed it as much as we did.
We'll have to get Seth back on. I think the conversation could go on longer. We did spend a lot of time speaking with him. I felt like after he answered one question, I felt like I had 10 more questions. If you have any questions for Seth or for us, or want to share your thoughts, please write to us. You can write to groweverything@gmail.com. You can reach out to us on our social media at Grow Everything Pod. We are also at Messaging Lab, so feel free to reach out that way. You can see it all in the show notes. Please subscribe, tell your friends about Grow Everything, start the conversations. We are very excited to have this podcast. And Karl, it's just been such a great time. And I'm excited for our next interview.
Yeah, and thanks to you, our listeners, we are the fastest growing biotech podcast in the universe. And so we're looking forward to continuing that growth. So thank you for listening. And until the next podcast.
Bye-bye.